Hey, folks, Zach Osterman here, Iowa Center, Indianapolis Star. This is Mind Your Banners for the evening of March 20th, 2025. We haven't done a Mind Your Banners After Dark in a while. He's Mike Neislick. I'm Zach Osterman. Mike, I'm awfully curious to see what kind of viewership we're going to get tonight. I suspect we might not be the most popular game in town with the first weekend of the tournament on. But we obviously have a lot to talk about, and we wanted to get to this yesterday, and unfortunately the day just got away from us because it was an incredibly busy day with Darren DeVries, or Darren, I'm going to get used to this at some point, Darren DeVries' announcement as Indiana's next men's basketball coach. And I guess the best place to start is at the beginning, just like what were sort of your initial reactions to everything that we saw, everything that we heard, everything that we sort of just processed yesterday from that press conference?
That's everything. Just
everything. The lighting, the music, the ambiance.
There was no music. There was not much ambiance.
And whose fault was that?
Is it our fault?
It was your fault.
I did not get the memo that I was responsible for his walk-in music. That could have been a good question. What his walk-in music would have been. Yeah. That would have been telling as to what, his personality or music tastes. No, I mean, I thought it was a relatively low-key, normal affair. I don't know, the whole thing. He was pretty straightforward. Seemed like that was sort of matched his personality. I thought from everything I saw, just reaction-wise, I thought fans were sort of pleased with everything he said. There wasn't anything sort of that, neon sign flashing out, jumping out. I mean, it was just more of like, sort of kind of like, I mean, we keep comparing him to Curt Cignetti, and when we talked to Scott Dolson, he's like, I hate to do it, but it did have that sort of feel like, here's how I win. Here's my blueprint. Here's what I value, and has these core beliefs. And that's how he's won in his 2 head coaching stops. And that's how he's turned around 2 teams in kind of consecutive, job changes. And so I think, Indiana fans are hopeful that will work for a third.
Yeah. I mean, it was kind of interesting to compare it to, I think it was Mark Pope at Kentucky. It was almost like a big fan event. Like it was almost like a pep rally. And I've seen Indiana do that before, and maybe not quite to the extent Kentucky did last year, but where they hold it out on the floor of Assembly Hall, and they fans come in, and you get at least a couple 300 people up in the stands, and they're cheering, and maybe they sing the fight song or whatever. I mean, it did feel like there was sort of a purposeful, no one here is trying to dazzle you. Everyone here just wants you to, kind of believe that this is going to work because, as you said, this guy's got his process. It's established. We've talked already about his resume, but 24 wins a season, over 7 seasons as a head coach. The not sort of like, so not totally substance over style, because I think that the problem with substance over style, and I think you ran into this if you're Indiana with Archie Miller a little bit, is that sometimes when you tell people just judge me on my wins and losses, and you don't leave them anything else, you don't give them any sort of character or any sort of just kind of like anything to kind of cling on to emotionally, then what happens is you get judged on the wins and losses, and it all feels a little bit dry and soulless. I think there was a little bit of sort of like, hey, him sort of trying to talk about who he was and where he was from and his kind of experience and his formative relationships in the game and all that. But there was, I think, a real sense of, hey, listen, just, I believe in the way I do it. I'm here because these people believe in that too. And if you give us time, you're going to see those results. And I don't know. I just sort of I think Indiana would have been. I feel like Indiana fans would have been turned off if they felt like they were being sold something. You know what I mean? After just a lot of frustration the last couple of years, if there was a lot of sort of, I don't know if it's like glitz or, sort of showmanship or whatever. If they would have felt like someone was trying to sell them something, I think that would have been
like if he got up there and said, "Google me."
Well, but that wasn't at the introductory press conference though.
There's time. You're saying there's time.
Well, what he's got to do is just get a couple of these portal wins and then say Google me.
Ask Jeeves me. GeoCities me.
Alta Vista me. Quick question. I'll answer this real fast from David Jackson. Basketball scholarships don't increase. I believe the basketball roster cap limit. Basketball roster cap. I will do this just to double check it. I believe the roster cap may be the 15 number. But I'm struggling to find the exact roster cap number for basketball. What's important to note is the roster or the basketball scholarships don't automatically increase. What has changed is there is a roster cap, and it's 15, 16, 18. It's somewhere in that range. You can fully fund all those scholarships if you want, but as we've heard Curt Cignetti talk about, that triggers some things that eat into your revenue sharing pool. At this point, I would expect Indiana to handle revenue sharing pretty much as just straight up and down revenue sharing. No extra scholarships, no Alston payments.
I think you said it was $2.5 million off the top of your cap number, so it'd be 18 million.
That's the same with the Alston payments, and I think a lot of schools are getting rid of the Alston payments too.
So that would decrease it from 20.5 to 18 for the first year, and so that's significant.
And if you had, this is a tangent, but if there are some schools that I think people expect in the SEC to add a bunch of scholarships in baseball. If you want to do that, that's fine. And then what you're doing is essentially just saying, we're going to share a little bit, maybe we're just not going to share any revenue with non-revenue sports, but we're going to provide $2.5 million in extra scholarships to those sports. But the scholarships don't increase. What increases is how many players you're allowed to have on scholarship up to a certain roster cap. Now, you can, as Curt Cignetti told us, and I didn't know this, you can spread that money out so you can have partial scholarships if you want. And as long as you stay at the initial 13 in total, you don't trigger that extra 2.5. But I think really what you're going to see is schools are going to have 12 to 13 scholarship players with a small handful of walk-ons up to the roster cap. And the only difference now is there is a roster cap rather than saying you can have as many walk-ons as you want, if that makes sense. We will do more on revenue sharing and all that stuff later because we are here very much to talk about Darren DeVries. I guess that, I don't know quite the way to phrase this next thing, but was there something in, whether it's what he said, we got a chance to talk to Scott Dolson as well. There were little bits and pieces you could pick up from the day. Like for example, his son Tucker was there in an IU sweatshirt. I think we can all, make 2 and 2 equal 4 there with where Tucker DeVries is. Was there something you left the building surprised to learn that maybe you didn't know when you walked in? Does that make sense? In terms of just, or something that, something that just kind of piqued your interest, I guess, that you learned throughout the course of the day. There were a couple of things for me, but I'm just curious for your take on that.
I don't know if surprise is the right word. I think the one thing that stood out, and I wrote about it, and I was the one who asked about it, is in terms of like team building, because he's done kind of 2 significant rebuilds in a row. Drake had to replace more than 50% of their production his last year there. That was the highest of his tenure since his first year. And then obviously at West Virginia, I think they had like less than 3% returning production in terms of minutes and scoring. With what he learned from that, what are sort of his principles? I mean, because the thing, and I didn't ask it because he said it right in the intro that, obviously first you need resources to compete. That's 1A, right? And so he acknowledged that right at the top, but he says it's not obviously everything. And then he kind of detailed the idea, which I think has been missing from Indiana the 2 years I've been here, in terms of like, look, you can get a collection of talent, but if they're not a team, you're not going to succeed. And I feel like that's sort of been, we've talked about what pinpointing the missing ingredient for the Hoosiers, and especially this year, was they had 3 top 25 signees, added Luke Goody as well, had all these, highly ranked players, and just never clicked. And, I thought the last 2 years that I've been here, Mike Woodson, sort of the GM, has been Mike Woodson, the coach's worst enemy, that he's sort of not assembled a group that fit together in a way that worked. And so I think Darren DeVries has shown through the last 2 years that he sort of understands that that's a very significant pitfall to when you have to build a roster. And look, ideally, and he said the same thing as Chris Ignetti, you balance out recruiting. Ideally the hope is high school, but in the first couple of years, that's not going to happen, right? And so it's going to be a significant transfer portal rebuild. And like, how do you do that? And the one comment that I thought was interesting, which he said later in the press conference, is that he had, assistants like, what if we cut a corner here? Or there's something in the background that you don't really like, but I mean, like, look, we can get this guy, or we can get this done, because, we need 8 to 10 guys to replenish our roster. Like, this might be a little easier. And he said, look, I'm never going to cut corners that way. That if there's something in a guy's background, or if there's something like when I'm sitting down with a guy that I don't love, or I don't like, I'm going to walk away from it, even if it be easier. And then I thought that was sort of telling to his, philosophy, just kind of, across, just that he's not going to cut corners. And I thought that was important and interesting to hear, that it would have been made his job much easier the last 2 years, and he was actively like, no, we cannot do that. And, maybe that's kind of what makes the difference in this world, in this current like NIL rev share world, that, teams that are just going to be quick to say like, well, this guy's a top player, we'll just grab him, run the risk of it, kind of blowing up in your face.
Yeah, I thought there was something kind of concurrent to that. Like, I guess I saw it from the other end, but it was something that struck me a little bit when I was looking at kind of the profile of his teams. A little bit listening to him talk yesterday, and a little bit I'll tease this because we're not going to podcast again until next week, and this story is going to drop in the morning, and I'm going to try and take tomorrow off, so you won't see me for a little while, at least on here. Was how kind of consistent his teams, his rosters tended to be. Like, if you look at his Drake rosters, they were, pretty, especially once he got it going, in terms of both Division I experience and minutes continuity, they were pretty consistently top half nationally. And there were a couple years where they were like top 50 nationally in those two numbers, Division I experience and minutes continuity. And like, that can be really hard in a mid-major where you don't have NIL, and where, anybody who maybe has some success sort of looks around and says, maybe the grass is greener, maybe I can get into a high major program, maybe I can make that jump and make some real money. But like, I talked to a number of coaches. The piece I did today that'll be out tomorrow is I talked to a few coaches kind of anonymously who coached against DeVries either in the Valley or the Big 12. And one of the head coaches I talked to that knew him from his time in the Valley said, he jokes, he said something like, basically, it felt like I was facing the same team for like 5 years in a row. That every year I faced them, it was just, old, experienced guys that knew him, guys that he knew. Everybody talked at length about how impressed they were with kind of like the intersection he made between sort of like his scheme and his X's and O's and his talent. In the idea that he wasn't a slave to just, his system, but he wasn't just making it up based around his talent. He was constantly, the old cliche of putting guys in positions to succeed. And the point this coach made was, you only get that with time, and you only get that with trust. Because if guys don't stick around, that means they don't trust you. And if they don't if you don't have time with them, then you don't learn what makes you You don't understand like what makes them good, what puts them in those positions, how to develop maybe to get them a little bit better in one area or another. I just thought it was kind of like, because to your point, at the end of the day, we all, around here, we all kind of looked at Mike Woodson's hiring and we said, NBA background, transfer portal, NIL, doesn't a lot of this fit someone who's been in the pro sort of, mold of roster construction. But it got, to your point, it just got too inconsistent, where like just too much of the roster is turning over and you don't feel like there's enough of kind of a thoughtful process toward getting the players you have into the positions that make them successful. So you can see the talent in a guy like Cannon Carlisle, for example, but you constantly watch him sort of, I thought he spent an entire season searching for a role and just not really finding it, and then just kind of wandering around lost in the system, taking bad shots, making mistakes, making questionable decisions. And yes, some of that will always go down on the player too, of course. But it's got to be the coach that, kind of makes all the pieces, keeps all the pieces. Number one, like imagines all of it first and make sure it all makes sense.
It has a clear vision for what the team should look like. And that was never,
then execute that on the floor. And, what frankly, it seemed like was a real shortcoming from Mike Woodson the last couple of years at Indiana seems like a strength for Darren DeVries, especially obviously his time at Drake.
Yeah, absolutely. And, but, I know that's why I thought it was notable. He wasn't criticizing past teams. He was just sort of talking about his.
It was,
And sorry. So, no, but I'm saying just like he was just sort of talking about in those terms. And, when you look at that West Virginia roster, the rebuild he did in terms of where that team was at, I don't think he'll have that little to work with at Indiana in terms of like what, he's bringing back, but like what he has committed and what the base is, but it's really impressive. And so, I think that certainly, stands out above, everything he talked about.
I also just like I don't know. And this, you said something there about it wasn't criticism of the past. I didn't feel like Indiana was trying to force anything on Wednesday. And this kind of goes to Scott Dolson, to Pam Whitten, to the event, to Darren DeVries. But like there did not seem to be any real sort of like really demonstrable, like we're going to prove to you that we're moving on, or you didn't feel like anyone took shots at anything.
Well, it was actually just the opposite. I thought the comment from Pam Whitten was notable in terms of she mentioned Mike Woodson, mentioned his history, and said the porch light will always be on for you. And I thought that was a nice way of saying, like, look, maybe things aren't great now, but like he's going to be welcomed back with open arms to this program. Obviously, he was never willing. We're still waiting for him to schedule the press conference to talk about him stepping down. I'm getting to think that won't happen, but he was not obviously willing to talk about it. But it was right at the start. They are not sort of like shunning what happened or turning it's not like a hard reset on like the idea of what Indiana went through this 4 years. It's like, look, we just need to get better. And we are grateful for everything that came in the last 4 years. And Dolson addressed it. And from the top, their message certainly wasn't like, this is a dawn of a new day. That wasn't what they're sort of how they framed this.
This was kind of like it was again, obviously a different personality, but it was another moment when it felt sort of a lot like the way they handled the Cignetti transition, where there was no sort of desire to point at what had come in the past as an example of what was wrong and sort of say, and this is how we're going to make it right. Now, obviously, Curt Cignetti, I think just by the force of his personality, sometimes leads people down that path when he talks about, we do it this way, or that, what was the comment he made? That
I
one
mean,
time?
he did say we had to throw out a lot of dead wood. I don't know if that.
Well, what did he? Well, he also said that one time, like that was the old Indiana. He was talking about a spring practice. And he said that, but like from Scott Dolson, from Pam Witten,
yes.
Again, it was all just sort of like facing forward without any of these sort of overly effusive, flowery, almost unnecessary language that you talk about. Like it's a dawn of a new era. It was just we went out. We were looking for these qualities in a basketball coach. We think we found him. This is our guy. We'd like you to meet him, ask him your questions, and then he's going to go to work. And I think we're seeing some questions here. Speaking of consistency and retention, does he have any assistants to stay with him for a while? He has a couple assistants on staff. I wouldn't be shocked to came with him to Indiana. A couple guys who played for him, I think, at Drake. One was a grad transfer. The other one, I think, played all 4 years for him at Drake. His staff has turned over a little bit. He took Tom Ostrom with him from Drake to West Virginia. Remains unclear. I'm not sure at this point. It feels like if Ostrom was going to come back to Indiana, that would be an easy move to make pretty quickly. I think, if you want to talk about like consistency, you will probably also see, his son join him in terms of like he's going to have a centerpiece player that he knows how to build around. And the other thing, if people ask, do you anticipate what his staff will look like? I think it will be very large. Number one, he had a pretty large staff with a variety of roles. He had I saw there were multiple coaches that were like, they were called assistant coaches. Cause remember that limit doesn't exist anymore, at least in terms of when guys can be on the floor working with players and stuff. But it would be like assistant coach for video coordination or assistant coach for, play and director of player development, that sort of thing. He had a substantial staff with him at West Virginia. Indiana had the number one staffing pool in the Big Ten in Mike Woodson's last year. And my understanding was Indiana had one of, if not the largest, assistant coaching staff in the country these last couple years under Mike Woodson. So I would anticipate it being a pretty big staff. What I would not necessarily anticipate is a ton of holdover. And I think we'll see if this proves true on the roster. I get the sense that behind the scenes there is maybe a bit of a desire. Again, this is a little bit Signetti-esque. Signetti only retained one assistant coach. When he came in, brought in, 6 of his own assistants. And the only assistant that he retained from Tom Allen's staff was about as outsider as anybody on that staff. Bob Bostad had just come in the previous year. I think there's going to be a fairly substantial turnover within that staff, but I think it's going to remain pretty large.
Yeah, and I mean, this was in our story this morning in terms of he'll have kind of full discretion in towards like how he wants to spend. Like he'll have a number essentially, and then he'll get to sort of divvy up that amount and sort of make the coaching staff in his image, essentially, just like how many he wants, what titles they have. Scott Dolson will have approval. But I mean, that's going to be all the balls in his court in terms of how he structures the staff. There's a lot of talk about a GM role or what that looks like. Again, that's all part of it. And that's going to be sort of him to sort of figure out and divvy up. But he will have the resources, like you mentioned, to sort of make it as big or small as he wants and how he wants to design it.
And the same is going to be true for his roster. Again, I think we can all put 2 and 2 together on Tucker DeVries. I wouldn't be shocked. There's a couple other players. I think we mentioned this already once, but there's a couple other players from West Virginia. I think Jonathan Powell is already in the portal. He played high school ball actually with Gabe Cupps. He was a freshman last year, played in all 32 games, was a starter by about the midpoint, by about mid-December, and started the rest of the season. Very good shooter for a freshman, 35% from behind the three-point line and 35%. I mean, almost the exact same percentage in Big 12 play as overall for a freshman. That's a really good number. We heard, or when I should say rather, when I talked to, some of these coaches I talked to today, one of the terms they came back to a lot describing his offense was really well spaced. And, I mean, they didn't say he was going like 4 out and just nothing but shooters, but just that the way bodies moved around the floor was always really well spaced. And that's obviously going to require some shooting talent. Again, I don't know, how dramatic the roster turnover will be. We've already seen 2 players into the portal, one publicly left open the sort of a path back to Indiana, Gabe Cupps. Malik Reneau didn't mention that. That doesn't mean it isn't there, but it certainly means he didn't go out of his way to say it the way Cupps did in his sort of his statement. DeVries also said
a little more close-ended too in terms of like
I've made lots of memories and DeVries also said a number of Indiana's players are on spring break, which is unsurprising because they weren't in the tournament. So he'll try to sit with them when he gets back. But I would not be stunned if we're talking about a decent amount of reset in that roster too. And you mentioned, some of the players West Virginia had committed out of high school. If they reopen their their process, maybe Indiana gets involved there. I know some people have asked about Braylon Mullins. The one question I really don't have answered right now, and this is for anybody in that position, because I know a lot of schools, especially high major schools, have been signing these kids to revenue sharing agreements. Can you release a kid from a revenue sharing agreement as easily as you can release a kid from an NIL? I don't.
Wasn't that the whole thing with the Wisconsin kid that's suing? I mean, that left the football because he signed.
I think so. Yeah, and Indiana had the deal with Lee Beebe, the transfer running back from UAB, and that was, I think, a slightly different thing. But like it I don't know if it's as simple as it used to be, where
you just let the kid out of their letter of the sign.
Yeah, like what Liam McNeely did a year ago with Indiana. I think revenue sharing.
Mackenzie Mbako did as well, essentially.
No, I think revenue sharing agreements might be more binding. So I don't know if necessarily like I don't know if it's quite as easy to just say, hey, like Braylon Mullins. People are asking about Braylon Mullins. I don't know if it's going to be quite as straightforward there.
Well, you reported also yesterday about the Bosnian kid reopening.
He's reopening. He was waiting to talk to DeVries. It seemed like he was more just trying to, kind of keep all his options on the table. His advisor told me they hope to talk to DeVries soon. I don't know if they have yet or not. Somebody like that, I can understand why you want more options, right? Because if he's going to have to come back over from Europe to make more visits, then you're going to have to, make sure that you kind of are aggressive, I guess, in that sort of world. But, Sisley's in. I think we can all kind of generally agree Tucker DeVries is in. It's just a matter of when that gets announced and certified. But that leaves you with, at least 11 spots. I went back and looked at this while you were answering a little bit ago. The roster cap is 15. The scholarship limit is still 13. Again, you can split that up. So you could do, like 11 players on full scholarship and then 4 players each on 50% of a scholarship. Apparently, I didn't know that, but Kurt Signetti, I trust, knows more about this than I do. He said you're able to do that. But assuming Indiana doesn't add scholarships in basketball, the limit is still 13. The roster cap now is 15. So if you want to have walk-ons, you're going to have to balance how many scholarship players you have with how many walk-on players you want to have. And maybe that's where, maybe that's where you split those scholarships up a little bit, right? Where maybe you go searching for a slightly higher caliber of walk-on and you say, we'll have 12 scholarship players and then split that 13th scholarship among 3 walk-ons. But maybe it's a slightly better player that can now come to a school like Indiana on at least a partial scholarship, whereas before they would have had to pay their own way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other, I guess the last thing I really wanted to dig into was what we both wrote about, which was, kind of the process basically. And, we got a chance to talk to Scott Dolson, kind of after the fact. And, there's still some things that, he was keeping close to the vest. We don't know, for example, exactly what the terms of DeVries' contract are yet. I think Indiana is still finalizing a revenue sharing number. But, it was interesting to just kind of walk through this process because, it has changed so much. I think Mike Woodson, the process that led to Mike Woodson was a little bit different because it was during COVID, and obviously he was also an assistant on an NBA team, so that was different. But I think about when Indiana hired Archie Miller, and if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, Archie's Dayton team lost to Wichita State on Indiana fired Tom Crean on March 16th. Archie's Dayton team lost to Indiana on March 17th. That same year, I want to say Sean Miller, I want to say Arizona got to the second weekend somewhere, and 2017 they went to the Sweet 16, and Archie was in the Sweet 16. They actually, funnily enough, they lost to Xavier, where Sean Miller now coaches. The whole family went out to San Jose for the Sweet 16, and while they were out there, Archie apparently was like, "Hey, if you guys got a minute, I want to bounce this off you because I think I got a shot at this Indiana job." It was announced over the weekend, and he was announced the week following. And that was perceived to be a pretty efficient process at the time. That was only 8 years ago. The fact that it has sped up so much since then, I think, tells you how much the portal has changed all of this. And obviously, there is the April 7th deadline this year. I won't make you go through that again. I know you roll your eyes whenever I talk about it, but I know there is an unusual sort of, motivation to get moving a little quicker this year. But the portal's not going away. The spring portal window is not going away. The idea that these weeks immediately following the season are important for your roster construction for the next season, that's not going away. And it was interesting to just kind of, walk back through a process that just had to move a lot more quickly, frankly.
Well, but some things did break their way. Like, I don't think they're naming him coach and having him fly in if West Virginia makes the tournament.
Sure, yeah.
And so, I mean,
you think that's one of the conspiracies? That there are some impressive conspiracies on West Virginia Twitter.
They worked with the committee to make sure they were
at least one, and I think it was tongue in cheek, but I can't promise you it was tongue in cheek. Was that it was that the committee intentionally left West Virginia out so that Indiana could move quicker.
That was very nice of them.
Yeah,
but no, it would have delayed things. I think obviously there's a sitting coach right now in the tournament that left during it or announced or accepted, but I don't know what would have unfolded for Indiana. But so things kind of broke their way though in terms of that. But no, like you said, the process. I think Darren was on lists of candidates as a name because of his success at both his recent stops, but I mean, he wasn't considered, it didn't, they kept it under wraps. I mean, they were very, Scott Dolson mentioned multiple times in terms of like, they were very leery of sort of making the team and the current coaches feel like they were sort of second fiddle and all that mattered was the future. Like they didn't want this overshadowing what they did win 5 of the last 7 in the regular season, overshadowing what they were doing or trying to close out the season. And so I thought that sort of hung over everything. And I mean, they kept everything really in house in terms of, leaks and things like that. And it was just sort of, his quote to us was nobody knew anything until really like the last hour.
Removing my own tongue from my cheek about the complaints from West Virginia fans, because I don't think it's unfair to read between the lines on some of the comments made Wednesday and feel like it was pretty clear that Indiana's discussions with Darren DeVries started before the end of the season. I think this is something everyone's just got to get used to. And if we want it to stop, then we've got to move the portal window back. And I think there is probably some argument for that. I think there's some vouch for that maybe like, would it hurt anyone for the portal window to be open 30 days starting April 15th? And I think that the trick there is, you have some pretty narrowly defined, downtimes in college basketball, and early mid-May is one of them, when coaches can reset, when players can get home for a couple weeks, that kind of thing. But I also think it's perfectly fair to say that there's probably a better solution than having the portal open. Last year it opened the Monday of the first week of the tournament. This year they at least moved it back to the Monday for if you don't have a coaching change, for the Monday after the first week into the tournament. So they at least moved it back that farther. They also shortened the window to go into the portal. But I still don't think it would hurt anybody for that to get a little bit further back so that we don't have this kind of stuff. But listen, if we're living in a world where Will Wade is literally saying, yes, I'm talking to North Carolina State at his news conference representing McNeese State in the NCAA tournament, we have to accept that, this stuff's going to happen on this kind of timeline anymore. And I think somewhere, and listen, this is just, anonymous accounts on Twitter, so I don't want to give it too much amplification. But I even somewhere saw someone say, well, that's just McNeese State. And I just thought, well, then where do you draw the line? Is it if a high major is trying to hire from a low major, well, what about a mid major? And how do we define that? What programs are low major? What programs are mid major? Is it coaches only making a certain amount of money? Is it coaches who have only won a certain number of games? Like, who gets to decide that it's okay for this school to be talking to this coach during the season, but not this school to be talking to this coach? Because the calendar is the calendar, and we can absolutely change it if we want to, but we clearly don't have an appetite for sort of wholesale reform here yet. I just don't see a way around this. It's not necessarily, I think, maybe the most conducive thing or the most healthy thing for the sport, but I just don't see how you get around it if you're a school that is trying to be as aggressive and successful as Indiana's trying to be.
Yeah, but it's not like it's not happened before either, even before the transfer portal. And you're just going to have these things, and it's the nature of the business. You got players, probably negotiating with their future teams now too. That stuff's not going to get public, but it's if you don't think it's happening, it's clearly happening, right? When players go in with, like these do not contact orders and have a destination in mind, those things don't happen out of the blue. So it's just I think it's just the current era. But like you said, when with players, things will get, it gets trickier now with revenue sharing and things like that. And it's going to be a whole new ball game here in another 6 months. Everything's going to change. So it'll be interesting to sort of watch how it all impacts all the different aspects of it.
Not to get preachy, but the way to fix this is to allow for some measure of collective bargaining, because that is how off seasons get organized in the pros, is in part discussing things like, when free agency is, when the draft is, when mini camps are, or OTAs, or voluntary workouts, or what rookie camp, whatever. If you bring everybody in the room and you give every stakeholder a say, and you make a good faith effort to try and organize something that works for everyone, then you might get a better solution. As it stands, you wind up with some of this, what feels a little bit like chaos, but doesn't feel like chaos for Indiana because they have their head coach. Darren DeVries, the 31st head coach in Indiana basketball history. I suspect there will be a lot more news being made in the coming days. A lot of people have asked. We've talked about staffing. We've talked as much as we could about portal. Someone said, is he the kind of guy we can expect big portal names, throw around money, or, a different approach? I don't know that. There's going to be some money. Indiana's got a healthy, between NIL and rev share, Indiana's got a very healthy number. I don't think, I think to your point earlier, we're also talking about a coach who maybe is at times going to emphasize taking a player that isn't necessarily, the top of the list at his or her, his position in terms of, maybe the portal or high school or whatever, but there's something that DeVries sees in that player that really fits what he's trying to do. But the point is, a lot's going to happen really fast, and we're going to be there for all of it. And I'll give you the last word, Mike. Sorry, I'm running out of words. I'm pretty tired after the last couple of days. I don't know about you.
Well, I would say just Javon Small from Oklahoma State, the recruiting. I mean, they won that recruiting battle last year at West Virginia. He was a named guy, and there was plenty of interest in him across, the country. So I wouldn't say he's going to shy away from it. I don't know necessarily that he's just going to go through the top 25 and be like, I need these 3 guys, and then let's call it a day. I think it'll probably be a little different than that. But he showed at West Virginia he was capable of winning a recruiting battle for one of a top level guy, and did target him and made him kind of a centerpiece of the class along with his son. And, to be honest, it might be different if his son wasn't sort of coming with them. Obviously, he might have to enter some higher battles. I mean, because his son would be one of those names that people would be throwing a lot of money at him if he was in the portal and didn't have his dad.
Well, I mean, there's a knock-on effect too, which is, taking Tucker DeVries is probably going to rule you out of some other recruiting battles. Right. Some, other players looking for a certain amount of shots or, possessions and whatever. Might say, well, no, not just because he's a coach's kid, but they're going to look at him like, well, he averages 17.5 points per game. Like, he's their star. He's their stud. I'm not going to get as much. But to your point, he was able to get Small as well as his son at West Virginia. And, I mean, again, I don't think it's unreasonable to contend that if Tucker DeVries had been healthy for all of last season, we'd maybe be talking about 22, 23 wins in DeVries' first year at West Virginia, not 19. So, we'll leave it there for now. He's Mike Nisley. I'm Zach Osterman. The mystery candidate, I'm confident, was not Doug Gottlieb. That would have been it would have been better left a mystery if that had been the case. For the Bloomington Herald-Times, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Mind Your Banners from March 20th, 2025. We'll be back next week. Until then, take it easy.